In the rain-soaked town of Willow Creek, tucked into America's heartland, a boy named Jamie Carter stood trembling on the threshold of Ellis's sweet haven. Margaret Ellis's bakery, his silhouette a fragile shadow against the storm. That night, the rain wasn't just weather, it was a curtain falling on a family shattered beyond repair. Hours earlier, in a modest clapboard house on Oak Street, Jamie had sat at a supper table crafted with love. Plates heaped with roast chicken glistening with gravy, a bowl of buttered peas steaming in the flicker of a single candle, a pitcher of iced tea sweating beads of cold onto a crocheted doily. His father, Paul, a mill worker with hands rough as sandpaper and a jaw set like stone, had been carving the meat with a slow, deliberate rhythm, the knife glinting in the dim light. His mother, Helen, a quiet woman with tired eyes and a gentle touch, had been passing a basket of cornbread, its golden crust still warm from the oven, her fingers brushing the wicker as she smiled faintly at her son. The kitchen was small, its walls papered in a faded floral print, the air thick with the scent of rosemary and the hum of an old refrigerator in the corner. Jamie had taken a deep breath, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his napkin, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest, and then his voice, small, quaking, had sliced through the cozy clatter. "Dad? Mom? I'm gay." The room had erupted in chaos. Paul's knife clattered against the plate, skittering across the table. His roar of "You're a disgrace!" booming through the house like thunder, his fist slamming down so hard the candle flickered and the peas spilled onto the worn oak surface. "No son of mine will shame this family. Get out," he'd bellowed, his face flushing a deep, furious red, his chair scraping back as he stood, towering over the boy. Helen's hands had frozen mid-motion, the cornbread basket trembling in her grasp, her eyes dropping to her lap as if the tablecloth could shield her from the truth. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper, frail and faltering. "Maybe you should go." Jamie, a betrayal that cut deeper than Paul's rage, a knife twisting in the boy's chest. Jamie had pleaded, his voice cracking like glass under pressure. "I didn't choose this. I just want you to know me. Please." But Paul had lunged, yanking him from the chair with a grip like iron, shoving a backpack into his arms, its straps frayed from years of school trips, and pushed him toward the door, the wood banging open as he thrust Jamie out into the rain. "Don't come back," Paul had shouted, his words swallowed by the storm as the lock clicked shut. Helen's silhouette fading behind the curtained window, her hand still clutching the basket, her silence a final blow. Now, drenched and broken, Jamie stumbled into Margaret's world, a widow who'd lost her own family to silence, and who'd soon find in him a chance to rewrite her past. "Hey, if that raw, heart-stopping moments got you hooked, smash that like button, share it with someone who needs this story, and subscribe to Heart Stories so we can dive into the rest together. Here we go." Margaret Ellis was a woman carved by time and tempered by loss, her silver hair swept into a loose bun that framed a face lined with 62 years of living, her hands roughened by decades of rolling dough in her modest bakery on Main Street. Ellis's sweet haven was a warm sanctuary in the gray sprawl of Willow Creek, a narrow shop with creaking oak floors polished by years of footsteps, walls lined with wooden shelves holding crusty sourdough loaves, rye rounds, and jars of homemade strawberry jam glowing red in the lamplight. A counter stretched across the back, its surface scratched from countless cuts of bread and pastries, a chalkboard above it scrawled with specials in her looping script. Apple turnovers fresh from the oven, cinnamon rolls dripping with glaze, pecan pie with a crust so flaky it melted on the tongue. A single lamp hung from the ceiling, casting a golden glow over the space, softening the rain-streaked windows and the shadows of the town beyond. The rain hammered down that night, a steady thrum against the tin roof, mingling with the hum of the oven baking scones and the faint twang of an old country song drifting from a radio perched on a shelf, its dial worn from her touch. Margaret was kneading dough, her apron streaked with flour, her fingers pressing into the soft mass with a rhythm born of years. When the bell above the door jingled, sharp and unexpected, cutting through the quiet like a cry, she looked up from her work, expecting a soggy regular seeking a hot coffee to chase the chill, but saw Jamie instead, thin as a sapling, soaked to the bone, his dark hair plastered to his forehead in wet clumps, his brown eyes wide with a fear that struck her like a memory. Water dripped from his clothes, pooling on the woven mat at the entrance, his sneakers squeaking as he took a tentative step forward, a tattered backpack slung over one shoulder, its faded blue fabric sagging under the weight of rain and despair. Can I come in?" he asked, his voice a tremble barely audible over the storm's roar, his breath puffing in the cold air that followed him inside. Margaret's heart lurched, a flash of her son Daniel surging through her, standing in their kitchen at 15, his voice shaking as he'd confessed his truth. Her silence a wall that had driven him away. She stepped forward, grabbing a thick towel from a hook behind the counter, her voice soft but steady, the tone she'd once used to soothe Daniel's scraped knees or calm his fears after a nightmare. "Come on in." "Honey, you're soaked through. Let's get you warm." Jamie hesitated, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for another rejection, then shuffled inside, his steps uncertain, and Margaret saw the burden he carried, something heavier than the rain, something she'd failed to lift from her own son all those years ago. She guided him to a stool by the counter, its red vinyl cracked from years of use, and wrapped the towel around his shivering frame, her fingers brushing his icy skin as she tucked it tight, her touch gentle but firm, a mother's instinct she hadn't used in too long. "What's your name?" she asked, pulling a chipped ceramic mug from a shelf cluttered with mismatched cups and pouring hot tea from the pot she kept simmering on a burner, its steam curling into the air like a fragile promise. He swallowed hard, his eyes flicking to the scuffed floor, then up to her, with a glimmer of trust breaking through the fear. "Jamie?" he said, his voice small, cracked like a dry twig. "Jamie Carter." Margaret nodded, setting the tea before him, the mug warm against his trembling hands, the scent of chamomile mingling with the bakery's sweetness of baked goods and sugar. "I'm Margaret. You're safe here, Jamie." "What happened?" He clutched the mug, his breath hitching in his chest, and after a long, shaky pause, the story poured out raw, jagged, a wound torn open in the quiet of a shop. Jamie recounted the supper in vivid detail, Helen's careful table, the roast chicken she'd basted with butter and herbs all afternoon, the peas she'd shelled that morning, Paul's knife slicing through meat in silence with a steady scrape, the moment he'd bared his soul to the only family he'd ever known. Paul's fury had been instant, his shouts of "Get out!" ringing through the house as he'd thrown the backpack, its contents spilling, a notebook, a sweater, a photo of the three of them at a fair, onto the floor. Helen's whispered surrender sealing his exile as she'd sat frozen, her hand still gripping the cornbread basket. "I begged them to listen," Jamie said, tears streaking his face, his voice breaking with every word. "I told them I didn't choose it, that I just wanted them to know me. But Dad said I wasn't his anymore. And Mom, she just let him push me out. She didn't even look at me." Margaret listened, her chest tightening with every syllable, each word a mirror to Daniel's night, his shaky "I'm gay" trembling in their kitchen, her mute stare as he'd stood there in his favorite flannel shirt, Tom's quiet, "Go if you need to," a feeble bridge that collapsed, and the door closing on her son, his footsteps crunching down the gravel drive into the night. She reached across the counter, her hand resting on Jamie's, her touch warm against his cold, damp fingers, a lifeline she hadn't thrown to Daniel all those years ago. "You're not alone," she said, her voice steady despite the ache clawing at her throat, threatening to spill over. "I've got a room upstairs. You can stay as long as you need, longer, if you want." Jamie's eyes welled, tears mixing with the rain still clinging to his cheeks, and he nodded, a broken thank you slipping out, soft as a prayer whispered in the dark. Margaret led him up the narrow stairs, each step creaking under their weight, to a spare room above the bakery, a space she'd kept for Daniel, unchanged since he'd left at 17, a time capsule of a life she'd lost. The bed was still made with a faded quilt she'd sewn during his childhood, its patches a patchwork of love, blue squares from his old overalls, red strips from a shirt he'd outgrown, stitched together on winter nights when he'd slept safe under her roof. A shelf held his old books, adventure tales with dog-eared pages, a worn copy of Treasure Island he'd read by flashlight, and a baseball glove sat in the corner, its leather cracked from summers when he'd played catch with Tom in the backyard, their laughter echoing through the dusk. She lit a lamp on the nightstand, its glow soft against the peeling blue wallpaper, casting shadows across a small desk where Daniel had once done his homework. His pencils still scattered in a tin can. Margaret watched as Jamie sank onto the mattress, his exhaustion a heavy cloak that seemed to pull him down, his soaked clothes clinging to his thin frame. "Sleep," she told him, pulling the quilt over his shoulders, her fingers lingering on the fabric, tracing the stitches she'd made for her son, now wrapping this boy in their warmth. "We'll figure it out tomorrow, together." He looked at her, his brown eyes searching her face, a question hovering on his lips. And then he whispered, "Why are you helping me?" Margaret paused, her hand still on the quilt, her breath catching as she met his gaze. "Because someone I loved needed this once," she said, her voice thick with years of regret. "And I didn't give it to him. I let him go, and I've lived with that every day since. I won't make that mistake again, not with you." She turned off the light, leaving him to the dark, and stood in the hall, her breath unsteady. Daniel's departure replaying in her mind, a suitcase packed in haste, a bus ticket clutched in his trembling hand, her silence a wall she couldn't tear down as he'd walked away into a night much like this one. Days stretched into weeks, and Jamie wove himself into Margaret's life like a thread she'd forgotten how to hold, a melody she'd stopped singing but now remembered every note. She taught him to knead dough, his hands fumbling at first, pressing too hard into the soft mass, flour dusting his shirt and the counter as he laughed at his own clumsiness, his voice breaking the quiet with a sound she hadn't heard in years. "Easy, like this," she'd say, guiding his fingers with hers, showing him how to fold and turn until the dough grew smooth, how to shape loaves that rose golden and crusty in the oven, their rhythm a quiet dance that filled the bakery with life. They'd sit over tea in the mornings, the shop hushed before the day's bustle began, him sharing stories of school, his love of sketching birds and trees in a notebook he kept tucked in his pocket, the parents he missed despite their rejection, his voice softening as he spoke of Helen's lullabies and Paul's rare, gruff praise, her telling him of Daniel, the son she'd lost to her own cowardice, the letters he'd sent from cities like Chicago and Seattle, filled with tales of new streets and lonely nights, now boxed in her attic. Their ink faded, but their weight heavy on her heart. Their mornings grew into rituals, him cracking eggs into a chipped yellow bowl she'd used for Daniel's pancakes, the shells crunching under his nervous fingers, while she measured sugar with a dented tin cup, her voice steady as she taught him the recipe, her showing him how to braid challah, their hands brushing as they twisted the strands, flour dusting their aprons like a shared snowfall, the bakery filling with the scent of yeast and warmth. She'd catch him staring out the window at the rain-soaked street, his eyes distant with memories of Oak Street, and sit beside him on a stool, a plate of scones between them, their steam rising in the cool air of the shop. "Tell me about your mom," she'd say, pouring tea into his mug, and he'd talk, Helen's gentle hands brushing his hair before school, her quiet songs hummed over the sink as she washed dishes, the way she'd hug him before bed, her warmth a memory he clung to despite her silence that night. Margaret would nod, her throat tight with her own echoes, and share her own, Daniel's love of baseball, his grin when he'd hit a double in Little League, his shouts of "Mom, did you see that?" ringing across the field. The night he'd baked cookies with her, flour on his nose as he'd giggled, "Mom,
I'm a mess!"
his laughter a sound she'd replayed in her mind for years. They'd laugh together, their voices mingling in the quiet bakery, then fall silent, the ache of lost families binding them closer, a thread of understanding weaving through their shared stories. She'd ruffle his hair, call him my boy, her fingers lingering in the dark strands, and he'd smile, a small, fragile thing that warmed her more than the oven's heat ever could, a spark of the sun she'd lost reignited in this boy she'd found. They'd spend afternoons in the shop, him sweeping the floors while she rolled out pie dough, the broom's soft swish blending with the clatter of her rolling pin, evenings where they'd sit by the counter after closing, sharing a bowl of soup she'd simmered, chicken and carrots, a recipe from her mother, its steam fogging the windows as they dipped crusty bread. their laughter a balm to the silence that had once filled her nights. Jamie would lean against her shoulder, his voice soft as he'd say, "Miss Maggie, this feels like home." And she'd wrap an arm around him, her heart swelling with a love she'd thought buried, a second chance she'd never expected. The town watched, their whispers sharpening into blades that cut through the bakery's warmth. Customers dwindled, some muttering about that kind not belonging in a decent shop, their noses wrinkling as they turned away from her bread, others shaking their heads at Margaret's choice to harbor him, their voices low with disapproval as they lingered by the door. "You're stirring trouble, Maggie," a regular warned, his coffee growing cold on the counter as he pushed it aside and left, his boots thudding on the oak floor. Margaret stood firm, her jaw set, her voice calm but edged with a steel forged from years of regret. "He's a child who needs a home, a good boy who's done nothing wrong. If that's trouble, I'll carry it with both hands and a smile." She'd lost Daniel to this town's judgment once, her silence a failure she'd borne like a scar. She wouldn't lose Jamie, too. They built a fragile family in that bakery, stitched with late-night talks over burnt biscuits slathered with jam, moments where Margaret felt like a mother again, her heart swelling as Jamie called her Miss Maggie with a grin that echoed Daniel's, his brown eyes bright with a trust she hadn't earned from her own son, but vowed to keep for this one. One evening, after locking the front door and turning the open sign to closed, Margaret ventured into the storeroom, a cramped space cluttered with sacks of flour, jars of spices, and old baking tins stacked in precarious towers. She was searching for a bag of sugar when her hand brushed a wooden box, its edges rough with dust, buried under a pile of faded aprons. She pulled it free, her breath catching as she lifted the lid. Daniel's things, untouched since he'd left at 17, a time capsule of a life she'd let slip away. Inside were photos of him at 16. His hair tousled from a summer breeze as he stood by the creek. A baseball cap faded from sun-soaked games perched on his head. A handful of ticket stubs from county fairs where they'd ridden the Ferris wheel together. His laughter ringing in her ears as they'd soared above the lights. A letter he'd written at 17. His handwriting shaky but bold. "Mom, I'm gay. Please understand. I just want to be me. I just want you to love me." She'd stayed silent then, frozen in their kitchen as he'd stood there in his favorite flannel shirt, his eyes pleading for her voice. Tom's quiet, "Go if you need to," a feeble bridge that collapsed under the weight of her fear. And Daniel had left. His last note slipped into her hand as he'd walked out, a plea unanswered. Tucked into a drawer she'd never dared open until now, she sank to the cold concrete floor, tears soaking the paper as her fingers traced his words. The ink smudged from years of hiding, and Jamie found her, his shadow falling across the dim light from a flickering bulb overhead. "Who's that?" he asked. Kneeling beside her, his voice soft with curiosity, his hands still dusted with flour from shaping rolls earlier. She handed him the photo. Daniel, smiling wide, his arm around her at a fair, cotton candy sticky on his fingers, his grin a mirror to the boy beside her now. "My son," she said, her voice breaking like brittle dough, crumbling under the weight of memory. "He was like you, brave enough to say it, to be himself. I didn't fight for him, didn't speak when he needed me. And he's gone, left this town, left me, because I was too afraid. I've regretted it every day since." Jamie took her hand, his grip small but steady, warm against her cold, trembling fingers, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet strength. "You're fighting for me," he said, his voice firm, a promise in his words, and Margaret pulled him close, her arms wrapping around him, a sob escaping as she held the boy who'd become her second chance, flour dusting them both like a shared vow, their breaths mingling in the stillness of the storeroom. Their bond deepened through the months, shared suppers of chicken soup she'd simmered all day on the stove, him stirring the pot with a wooden spoon while she chopped carrots and onions at the counter, their laughter mingling with the clatter of utensils and the bubble of broth. Quiet afternoons where he'd read Daniel's old books aloud, his voice stumbling over pirate tales and shipwrecks as she darned socks by the window, the rain tapping a soft rhythm against the glass. Nights when he'd wake from nightmares of Paul's shouts and Helen's silence, his cries piercing the dark, "Miss Maggie, don't let them take me!" And she'd sit on his bed, humming a lullaby she'd sung to Daniel. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." Her hand smoothing his dark hair until his breathing steadied. His small hand clutching hers as he drifted back to sleep. She'd bake him cookies, chocolate chip, soft and warm, the kind Daniel had loved. The kitchen filling with the scent of melting sugar, and watch his face light up. A grin breaking through the shadows that lingered in his eyes. "These are the best. Miss Maggie!" A balm to her soul. Jamie would hug her, his arms tight around her waist, his head resting against her shoulder, and whisper, "You're my family now." And she'd hold him back, tears pricking her eyes as she pressed a kiss to his forehead, knowing he'd filled a hole she'd carried for too long. A love she'd thought lost forever reborn in this boy she'd claimed as her own. But the town's hate grew bolder, a storm of its own brewing beyond the bakery's walls. Rocks shattered the shop's windows one night, the crash jolting them from sleep. Red paint scrawling "freak" and "get out" across the glass in jagged, angry letters. The words dripping like blood in the rain. Margaret cleaned it up the next morning, her hands steady as she scrubbed with a rag and a bucket of soapy water. The glass gleaming again by noon, but Jamie's eyes darkened with fear, his hands shaking as he swept the shards into a pile, the broom trembling in his grip. "This is my fault," he whispered, his voice thick with guilt, his shoulders slumping as he stared at the broken pieces scattered across the floor. She knelt beside him, fierce and unyielding, her hands gripping his shoulders as she looked into his eyes. "No, honey, this is their hate, not yours. We're stronger than this. You and me. We've got each other, and that's what matters." She painted over the words with a fresh coat of white, her brush steady as she covered every trace, then hung a sign in the window, "All welcome," its letters bold and black, a quiet defiance against the town's cruelty, and kept the doors open, the bakery's warmth a beacon against the gray. The threats multiplied, notes slipped under the door at dawn, their scrawled words sharp with venom. "Leave or else. You don't belong," crumpled in Margaret's hands as she tossed them into the trash. Calls in the night, a voice hissing slurs through the crackling line before hanging up, leaving her gripping the phone with white knuckles. Another brick crashing through the glass one evening, narrowly missing Jamie as he stacked loaves on a shelf, the thud echoing as he ducked. His cry of "Miss Maggie!" piercing her heart. His sketches slowed, his pencil idle on the counter. His laughter faded to a rare, fleeting sound. His sleep broke with nightmares of running through rain-soaked streets, his small frame trembling as he woke calling for her. "Don't let them take me." She'd hold him close, her arms a shield, her voice steady as she whispered, "I've got you. My boy, no one's taking you from me." But the fear lingered in his eyes, a shadow she couldn't banish. One morning, after a night of restless sleep punctuated by the crash of thunder and the howl of wind, Margaret found him packing. His bag half full with his few belongings, his notebook, a sweater she'd knitted him, a photo of them laughing over a batch of lopsided rolls, his face pale but resolute, the quilt folded neatly on the bed, its patches smoothed by his hands. "I can't stay," he said, his voice steady despite the tears welling in his brown eyes, his hands clutching the straps of his backpack. "They won't stop. And I don't want you hurt because of me. I've seen the glass, the paint, the way they look at you now." She grabbed his arm, panic surging like a tide, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "You're not going anywhere. Jamie, you're my family now. My boy, and I won't let you run." Her voice cracked, tears streaming down her cheeks as she clutched his hands, her fingers tracing the flour still dusted on his skin from yesterday's baking, a mark of their shared days. But Jamie shook his head, gentle but firm, his eyes soft with a love she hadn't seen since Daniel stood in her kitchen all those years ago. "You've given me more than my own ever did. Miss Maggie, more than I thought I'd ever have again. I'll find a shelter up north, start over somewhere safe, but I can't watch them break you too, not you." She begged, her voice rising in desperation. "Please, Jamie, stay. I need you. You're all I've got left." Her sobs echoing in the small room, her hands trembling as she pulled him close. But he hugged her tight, his small frame trembling against hers, his breath warm against her shoulder as he pressed his face into her apron. "You're the mom I always wanted. he whispered, his voice breaking with every word, his tears soaking into the fabric. "And I'll never forget you, never." He held her for a long moment, his arms strong despite his youth, then slipped out of her grasp, stepping out the door into the rain, his backpack a shadow fading down Main Street, the bell jingling one last time as it swung shut behind him, a sound that rang in her ears like a farewell she couldn't bear. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, the bakery silent, the air cold and empty without him, the scent of chamomile lingering where his mug sat untouched. She sank to the floor, her knees hitting the oak with a dull thud, Daniel's letter still in her pocket. Jamie's last sketch, a sparrow taking flight, crumpled in her hand, its lines blurred by her tears as she clutched it to her chest. She'd fought this time, given him a home, a love she'd denied her son. But the town's hate had driven him away, and she felt the loss like a second blow. A wound reopened and bleeding fresh, days blurred into weeks, then months. The bakery quieter now, the counter bare where he'd drawn his birds. The room upstairs a shrine of quilts and echoes, its air heavy with his absence. She cleaned the shelves, knead dough alone, her hands moving through the motions, measuring flour, rolling out scones, baking loaves. But her heart stayed with Jamie, out there somewhere beyond her reach, beyond the rain that tapped endlessly against her windows. Rumors trickled back through the town's grapevine. He'd made it north, found a shelter in a city of bright lights, but no word came. No call, no letter. And Margaret wondered if he'd ever know how much he'd healed her, how much she'd loved him, how much she missed the boy who'd called her family. Time dragged on, the seasons shifting through Willow Creek, spring rains giving way to summer heat, then autumn's crisp bite settling over the town like a blanket. Margaret aged with them, her hair whitening at the temples, her hands slowing as arthritis crept into her knuckles, the bakery a relic of brighter days, its shelves less full, its warmth dimmed by the quiet that had settled in Jamie's wake. She'd sit by the window after closing, rain streaking the glass or frost etching patterns in the cold, and unfold Jamie's sketch, its edges worn from her touch, Daniel's letter resting beside it, 2 boys she'd loved. One lost to her silence, the other to a town's cruelty. She'd traced the sparrow's wings, her fingers trembling, and whispered to the empty shop, "Come back, my boy, just once." Her voice a prayer swallowed by the hum of the oven, the only sound left in her days. The rain tapped on, a mournful echo of the night he'd come, and she'd close her eyes, seeing him in the doorway, soaked and scared, a memory she clung to like a lifeline. Then, one crisp autumn morning, 2 years after he'd left, the bell jingled again, its chime cutting through the stillness like a note of hope. Margaret looked up from her rolling pin, flour dusting her apron and the counter where she'd been shaping dough for cinnamon rolls, her hands pausing mid-motion as her breath caught. There he was, Jamie, taller now, his dark hair longer and curling at the ends, his brown eyes bright with a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. He stood in the doorway, a new backpack slung over his shoulder, its straps sturdy and unbroken, a sketchbook tucked under his arm, its cover worn from use, and a smile breaking across his face, a smile she'd dreamed of every night since he'd walked away, a grin that lit the room like the sun breaking through clouds. "Miss Maggie," he said, his voice deeper but still soft, carrying the warmth of the boy she'd known. "I came back." She dropped the rolling pin, its clatter lost in the rush of her steps, her hands trembling as she crossed the bakery in 3 long strides, flour trailing behind her like a comet's tail. She pulled him into her arms, her tears soaking his jacket as she held him tight, his warmth real and solid against her, his heartbeat a steady rhythm she felt through the layers of cloth. "You're home," she whispered, her voice thick with relief, cracking with the weight of 2 years' longing. And he hugged her back, his arms strong now, his breath steady as he pressed his face into her shoulder, his scent a mix of rain and the north he'd conquered. "I couldn't stay away," he said, his voice muffled against her apron. "Not from you. You're my family. Miss Maggie? Always will be." She pulled back just enough to look at him, her hands cupping his face, tracing the lines of a boy grown into a young man, his eyes meeting hers with a love that hadn't faded, a bond that had bent but never broken. Jamie stepped inside, the bakery alive again with his presence, the air warming as if the oven had flared anew, and Margaret felt the pieces of her heart mend, not fully, not perfectly, but enough to feel whole. He dropped his backpack by the counter, its thud a promise of permanence, and pulled out his sketchbook, its pages spilling open as he set it down, drawings of birds in flight, trees swaying in wind, and now her face, smiling in pencil lines, captured in moments of dough and laughter. "I drew you every day," he said, his grin widening as he flipped through. "To remember, to keep you with me." She took his hand, her fingers lacing through his, and led him upstairs, the quilt still there on the bed, its patches a testament to the love she'd sewn into it. Now wrapping them both, they sat together, tea steaming between them in mismatched mugs, his sketches spread across the table like a map of their time apart. Birds, trees, her face, and now a new one, unfinished, of them together. His pencil poised to finish it here. He told her of the north, a shelter that took him in. Its walls cold but safe, a job at a diner flipping burgers, the grease staining his hands but paying his way, a small room he'd rented with his savings, its window overlooking a park where he'd sketched to keep the loneliness at bay. "But I missed you," he said, his eyes soft. "Missed this place. The scones. The way you hum when you bake. Missed my mom." Margaret's tears fell anew, her hand squeezing his as she smiled through them. "You're my boy, always have been. Always will be." The town had tried to break them, rocks through windows, words on walls, but they'd held on. Their bond a quiet defiance, a family forged not by blood but by choice, by love that endured the storm and found its way back. Margaret looked at him. Her boy returned, and knew she'd never lose him again, not to silence, not to hate, not to distance. The bakery hummed with life once more, customers trickling back, drawn by the warmth. The scones, the story of a boy and a woman who'd defied the odds. They'd baked together, his hands steady now as he shaped dough beside her, their laughter filling the air. A song of home, the rain tapped on, a gentle rhythm now, no longer mournful but joyful. And in that small shop on Main Street, love won, a victory hard-earned, deeply felt, and forever theirs, a testament to the family they'd built and the strength that brought him back to her arms. This story belongs to Margaret Ellis, a woman who opened her heart to a boy cast out, who built a family from flour and tears, and who found him again when the world tried to tear them apart. It's about love that endures, bonds that bend but don't break, and the quiet triumph of coming home. If this warms your soul, press like, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to Heart Stories for more tales that lift us up. Tell us in the comments, what would you fight to keep close?